The air in Genevieve Dubois' kitchen was as thick and heavy as the bayou mud outside her door. It was the summer of 1895 in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, a season so relentlessly humid that it felt like breathing water. Genevieve wiped a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her eyes fixed on the glass jar sitting innocently on her rough-hewn wooden table. It was a purchase of morbid curiosity, an item bought on a whim from the strange, silent widow at the edge of the market. The other vendors had their vibrant piles of okra, tomatoes, and gleaming catfish on ice, but the widow had only this: a dozen or so sealed jars containing a pale, ambiguous meat, submerged in a cloudy, vinegared brine. She called it Cajun spiced pork. It looked nothing like any pork Genevieve had ever seen. The meat was fibrous, almost stringy, and its color was an unsettling off-white like bleached linen. For 2 days the jar had sat on her table, a silent dare. Her husband, Luke, had scoffed, calling it swamp trash fit only for the gators. But poverty and annoying hunger had a way of making one adventurous. With a sigh that fogged the already damp air, Genevieve took a small knife and pried the metal lid open. A soft hiss broke the silence, followed by a smell that was both pungently spiced and faintly, cloyingly sweet. It was a disturbing aroma, a perfume of the charnel house disguised with cloves and peppercorns. She fished out a small piece with the tip of her knife and held it up to the sliver of light filtering through the grimy window pane. The texture was wrong, too soft, too personal, and then she saw it. Embedded within the pale flesh, unmistakable and horrifying, was a small, dark mole, from which sprouted a single, coarse black hair. The scream that tore from Genevieve's throat was sharp enough to startle the cicadas into silence. The jar fell from her trembling hands and shattered on the packed dirt floor, its grotesque contents spilling out in a pool of brackish brine. The piece of flesh with its human blemish lay there, a testament to an unspeakable culinary secret. This was not the beginning of the story, but merely the moment the curtain was violently ripped away, revealing a stage set for a macabre play that had been unfolding in the shadows of the cypress swamp for months. To understand the horror of the jar, one must first understand the place from which it came. Plaquemines Parish in 1895 was a land of staggering contradictions. It was a place of immense beauty and suffocating dread, a ribbon of fertile earth and treacherous marshland clinging to the final stretches of the Mississippi River before it surrendered to the Gulf. The air was perfumed with jasmine and decay, the ground saturated with water and history. It was a community of French-speaking Cajuns, Creole families who traced their lineage back to colonial New Orleans, and newly freed African Americans trying to carve out a life from the unforgiving soil. Here, folklore was as real as the oppressive heat. Tales of the loup-garou, the werewolf, and the feu follet, ghostly lights that led travelers to their doom in the swamp, were not children's stories. They were warnings, whispered on front porches during the long, suffocating twilight hours. This was a world suspended between the modern age and ancient fears, a place where a sheriff might carry a new Colt revolver but would also cross himself when passing a graveyard at night. It was into this simmering gumbo of faith, fear, and suspicion that the widow, Elodie Robichaux, had arrived at the market, a ghost from the deepest parts of the swamp. Elodie Robichaux was a specter long before she began selling her forbidden wares. She lived in a dilapidated cabin built on stilts over the brackish water, deep in a part of the bayou the locals called the Gator's Maw. It was a place accessible only by pirogue, a maze of narrow waterways choked with Spanish moss and water hyacinths, where the cypress trees stood like ancient, skeletal sentinels. Her husband, Jean-Pierre, had been a trapper, a hard man with a reputation for silence and a short temper. He had vanished 6 months prior. The official story, the one Sheriff Broussard reluctantly wrote in his ledger, was that Jean-Pierre had been taken by a gator or had simply gotten lost in a storm and drowned in the rising swamp waters. Such things were common enough not to warrant a deep investigation. People vanished in the bayou. It was a fact of life, an accepted tax levied by the wild, unforgiving landscape. Elodie had observed the traditional mourning period, a recluse in her isolated home. No one saw her. No one visited. The cabin was too remote, too steeped in bad luck whispers for anyone to bother. Then one Tuesday, she appeared at the market in St. Bernard. She was a gaunt figure, dressed in a faded black mourning dress that seemed to hang from her bony frame. Her face was a mask of premature age, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes dark, hollowed-out things that seemed to absorb the light around them. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and her voice, when it emerged, was a dry, rasping whisper, like dead leaves skittering across stone. Her stall was nothing more than a rickety table at the far end of the market, away from the other vendors, who instinctively gave her a wide berth as if she carried a contagion of sorrow. On the table sat her jars, their contents a mystery, their origin a terrifying question no one yet knew how to ask. The initial reaction to Elodie's stall was one of suspicion and morbid curiosity. The people of the parish were not strangers to unusual foods. They ate gator tail, turtle stew, and squirrel brains. But there was something deeply unsettling about the widow's jars. The meat floated in its brine like a preserved biological specimen, its identity deliberately obscured by spices and pickling. An old trapper named Jacques, a man who boasted he could identify any animal by its track, taste, or smell, was the first to buy one. He'd scoffed at the whispers, claiming the townsfolk were as skittish as rabbits. He bought a jar, paid Elodie her nickel without a word, and took it home. He was never seen again. At first, his absence was barely noted. Men like Jacques were transients, following the trapping seasons, often disappearing for weeks at a time into the deep swamp. It would be a month before anyone thought to connect his vanishing with the widow's strange preserves. But the seed of unease had been planted. People began to watch Elodie more closely at the market. They noted how she never seemed to eat or drink. They saw how the flies, which swarmed every other food stall, seemed to avoid hers completely. Her jars sat in the oppressive heat, yet the contents never showed signs of spoilage. Rumors began to fester, growing like mold in the damp Louisiana air. Some said she was practicing hoodoo, using forbidden magic to preserve the meat. Others whispered that the meat was not from any animal known to God or man, but some unholy creature she had summoned from the swamp's black heart. The term loup-garou started to be uttered in hushed tones, not as folklore, but as a genuine, terrifying possibility. Was she trapping something more than raccoons and muskrats in the gator's maw? The macabre nature of the mystery began to take hold, a cold dread that seeped into the very soul of the community. Before Genevieve Dubois' horrifying discovery, the sales had been few and far between. Only the poorest, the most desperate, or the most foolishly brave dared to purchase a jar from the silent widow. A handful of drifters passing through town, a family on the brink of starvation, a young man trying to prove his courage on a drunken bet. And after each purchase, a subtle, almost unnoticeable pattern began to emerge. A drifter who was supposed to be heading north was never heard from again. The desperate family's eldest son, sent to find work in New Orleans, seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. These were threads too thin to be woven into a tapestry of suspicion, at least not at first. They were dismissed as the unfortunate but ordinary tragedies of life on the fringes of society. People moved on, they died, they disappeared. The parish was a transient place, but the whispers persisted, a low hum of anxiety beneath the daily clamor of life. The story of Elodie's husband, Jean-Pierre, was resurrected and re-examined. Had he really been taken by a gator? People now remembered his arguments with Elodie, the sounds of shouting that would drift across the water from their isolated cabin late at night. He had been a drinker, prone to violence. Had she finally had enough? The image of Elodie, frail and silent, didn't fit the profile of a murderer, and yet the swamp held secrets. It was a place where a body could disappear forever, pulled down into the silt and digested by the relentless cycle of life and death. The idea that she had killed her husband was a dark, forbidden thought, but it was a logical one. The alternative, the one suggested by the jars of strange, pale meat she now sold at the market, was a horror beyond the realm of logic, a macabre notion that the mind refused to entertain. It was too monstrous, too disturbing to even consider. Sheriff Antoine Broussard was a pragmatic man in a world that was anything but. He believed in evidence, in facts, in the tangible reality of footprints and fingerprints. He had little time for the superstitious gossip that was the lifeblood of the parish. When Genevieve Dubois, hysterical and retching, came to his office with her shattered jar and its sickening contents, his first instinct was to dismiss it. The object she claimed was a mole with a hair could have been anything, a piece of burnt spice, a clump of peppercorns, a trick of the light and a terrified imagination. He listened patiently, his face a stoic mask, while she recounted her story, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion. He assured her he would look into it, a platitude meant to calm her down and send her on her way. But after she left, the image she had painted lingered in his mind, a mole with a hair. It was such a specific, visceral detail. He had seen enough bodies in his time, victims of knife fights, drownings, and disease, to know the mundane, intimate details of human anatomy. He walked over to the evidence bag containing the piece of meat she had brought him. He opened it and the same sweet, spicy, corrupt smell filled his small office. He poked at the flesh with the end of a pen. It was disturbingly soft. His gut, an instinct he had learned to trust more than any witness, told him something was deeply wrong. He couldn't arrest a woman based on parish gossip and a hysterical housewife's claim. He needed more. He needed to visit the source of this growing dread. He needed to take a trip down the bayou to the Gator's Maw and have a talk with the widow, Elodie Robichaux. The thought sent an uncharacteristic chill down his spine. The cold case of her husband's disappearance was about to be reopened. The journey to Elodie's cabin was a descent into a primeval world. Sheriff Broussard took his deputy, a young, nervous Creole man named Felix, in a small, flat-bottomed boat. As they left the main channel of the river and entered the tangled labyrinth of the bayou, the world transformed. The sky became a mere sliver, glimpsed through a dense canopy of cypress and oak trees draped in funereal shawls of Spanish moss. The air grew still and hot, thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation. The only sounds were the buzz of insects, the guttural croak of bullfrogs, and the gentle lapping of the dark, soupy water against their boat. Felix, who had grown up on these waters, seemed unnerved, his eyes constantly scanning the banks, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip. He kept muttering about old legends, about a creature called the Leditch, the spirit of an unbaptized infant that had grown into a monstrous guardian of the swamp. Broussard ignored him, focusing on navigating the treacherous, narrow passages. The place felt malevolent, ancient, and deeply hostile to human intrusion. After nearly 2 hours, they saw it. The cabin was a dark shape squatting in the gloom, barely distinguishable from the surrounding swamp. It was perched precariously on stilts, its wood warped and blackened by humidity and time. A thin plume of smoke curled from a crooked stone chimney, a ghostly finger pointing towards the oppressive gray sky. There was no sign of life, no boat tied to the rickety porch, no fishing nets hung out to dry. The place felt abandoned, a forgotten relic slowly being devoured by the swamp. But the smoke meant someone was home. As Broussard steered the boat towards the crude landing, he felt a profound sense of trespassing, as if he were about to breach a forbidden sanctuary, a place where the normal laws of man and nature no longer applied. As they tied the boat to a rotting post, the silence that enveloped the cabin was absolute. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, watchful stillness, the kind that precedes a violent storm. Broussard and Felix climbed the creaking steps onto the porch, their boots echoing unnervingly in the quiet. The sheriff knocked on the door, a solid, authoritative rap. The sound was swallowed by the swamp, leaving only the ringing in their ears. They waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. "Mrs. Robichaux." "Sheriff Broussard, I'd like to have a word with you." Still, there was no answer. Felix gestured towards a grimy window and Broussard peered through the glass. The inside of the cabin was a cave of shadows, the dim light struggling to penetrate the gloom. He could make out the shapes of a table, a chair, a cold hearth. And then he saw her. Elodie was sitting in a rocking chair in the far corner, perfectly still, facing away from them. She wasn't rocking, she was just sitting there, a motionless silhouette in the darkness. It was profoundly creepy. It was as if she were a doll placed in the corner, a forgotten plaything. "She's in there," Broussard whispered to Felix. "She's ignoring us." He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. With a shared look of apprehension, Broussard pushed the door open. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing the cabin's interior. The air that rushed out to meet them was cool and carried a familiar, sickeningly sweet and spicy odor, the same smell from the jar but 100 times more potent. It was the smell of a pantry, a smokehouse, and a tomb, all rolled into one. Elodie didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge their presence in any way. She just sat there, her back to them, a silent, unnerving sentinel in her house of shadows. The inside of the cabin was a single, cluttered room that assaulted the senses. The overwhelming smell was the first thing that hit them, a thick, almost tangible miasma of pickling vinegar, cloves, smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic that lay beneath it all. The place was meticulously, almost obsessively clean. The wooden floors were scrubbed bare and the few pieces of furniture, a bed, a table, 2 chairs were free of dust. But the walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat hundreds of glass jars. They were of all shapes and sizes, each one filled with the same pale, ambiguous meat, submerged in brine. It was a horrifyingly domestic scene, a larder stocked for a long winter, but the sheer quantity of the jars was unnerving. Broussard's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of the ordinary, anything that could give him cause for a real search. He saw a large cast-iron stove, a butcher's block scrubbed white from countless cleanings, and a set of gleaming knives hanging in a neat row on the wall. These were the tools of a woman who prepared her own food, common enough in the bayou. But the scale of the operation was baffling. Where was she getting all this? Pork. Elodie finally turned her head, her movements slow and deliberate like an automaton, her dark, hollow eyes fixed on the sheriff. There was no fear in them, no surprise, only a flat, empty resignation. "Sheriff," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper, "I have no trouble for you here." Broussard took a step forward, trying to keep his tone calm and professional. "Mrs. Robichaux, I'm here about your husband, Jean-Pierre. And about what you're selling at the market." He gestured towards the wall of jars. "Folks are getting concerned. I need to know what's in these jars." Elodie offered a faint, chilling smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Preserves, Sheriff, just preserves to get me through." Sheriff Broussard felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The woman's calmness was more disturbing than any outburst would have been. He was a man of the law, operating on the edge of a world ruled by superstition, and in that moment he felt the two blur. His badge felt like a useless piece of tin against the ancient, unsettling power that seemed to emanate from this small, gaunt woman. He needed concrete evidence, not just a bad feeling and the ravings of a frightened housewife. He pushed on, his voice firm. "Ma'am, a complaint has been made, a serious one. I'm going to have to inspect your property, including that smokehouse out back." He gestured with his chin towards the rear of the cabin, where a smaller, windowless shack was visible through the open door. It was from there that the faint wisp of smoke they had seen earlier was emanating. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Elodie's face. It wasn't fear, but something closer to annoyance, as if he were a bothersome insect she was contemplating swatting away. "There is nothing for you there, Sheriff," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Only my private business, my husband's work." It was the mention of her husband that sealed it for Broussard. Jean-Pierre had been a trapper, not a hog farmer. He dealt in pelts, not preserved meats. The lie was too blatant, too clumsy. Broussard knew he was on the right track. The trail of disappearances, the hushed whispers of forbidden practices, the horrifying contents of that shattered jar. It was all leading to this isolated, stinking cabin. The history of this place was dark, and Broussard was beginning to realize he was standing right in the middle of its most macabre chapter. If you find these forbidden histories as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing. The investigation into the widow's smokehouse is about to lead somewhere truly horrifying. Leaving Felix to watch the unnervingly calm widow, Broussard stepped out the back door and onto a narrow walkway that led to the smokehouse. The structure was crude, built of rough-hewn cypress planks, its roof patched with rusted tin. The door was secured with a heavy iron latch. The smell of smoke was stronger here, but it was mixed with that same sweet, corrupt odor that permeated the main cabin. It clung to the back of his throat, making him want to gag. He lifted the latch and pulled the heavy door open. A wave of thick, greasy smoke billowed out, stinging his eyes. He stepped inside, and for a moment he could see nothing but a swirling gray haze. As his eyes adjusted, the shapes within began to resolve, and the full, unadulterated horror of what Elodie Robichaux was doing became sickeningly clear. Hanging from the rafters on iron hooks were not sides of bacon or pork shoulders. They were long, slender cuts of meat, unmistakably human arms and legs, their skin blackened and cured by the hickory smoke. On a large table in the center of the room lay a human torso, partially dismembered. The scene was one of industrial-scale butchery, a methodical and practiced process. The tools were laid out neatly beside the body: a bone saw, a cleaver, and a set of razor-sharp flensing knives, all of them stained with dried blood. This was not a crime of passion. This was a craft. Broussard felt a wave of nausea so powerful it buckled his knees. He stumbled back out into the humid air, gasping for breath, the macabre images seared into his mind. He had dealt with death his entire career, but this was something else entirely. This was a violation of the most sacred taboo, a descent into a level of depravity he had not believed possible. The cold case of the vanished trappers and drifters was no longer cold. It was here, hanging, smoked and cured, ready for the market. Broussard leaned against the exterior wall of the smokehouse, his mind reeling, trying to process the abomination he had just witnessed. He drew his revolver, the cold steel a small comfort against the overwhelming dread. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Jacques, the old trapper who had vanished, the nameless drifters, the young man who never made it to New Orleans. They hadn't just disappeared. They had been harvested. They had been lured to this isolated place, or perhaps hunted in the swamp like animals, their bodies brought back to this workshop of horrors to be systematically disassembled, processed, and packaged for consumption. The widow wasn't just a killer. She was a purveyor of human flesh, a cannibal who had turned her monstrous appetite into a cottage industry. He looked back at the main cabin where Felix stood guard over the silent, enigmatic woman. How could someone so frail, so seemingly passive, be capable of such monstrous acts? The dismemberment he had just seen required immense strength and a cold, surgical precision. Had she done this alone, or was there an accomplice? The thought of her husband, Jean-Pierre, flashed in his mind. The official story was that he had drowned, his body never recovered. But now, a far more gruesome possibility presented itself. Perhaps Jean-Pierre hadn't been Elodie's first victim in the traditional sense. Perhaps he had been her teacher. Perhaps this horrifying business had been his trade all along, and his death was merely a transfer of management. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred into a terrifying, indistinguishable gray. The curse of this place was deeper and older than he could have imagined. Broussard straightened up, his resolve hardening. He had to get Elodie and Felix out of there and bring the full force of the law down on this house of nightmares. When Sheriff Broussard re-entered the cabin, his gun drawn, the scene was exactly as he had left it. Felix stood by the door, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his eyes wide with fear. Elodie Robichaux sat in her rocking chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She looked up at Broussard and her eyes met his. There was no surprise at the sight of his drawn weapon. Instead, there was a flicker of something that looked disturbingly like pity. "You see now, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "A woman must make her way in this world. A widow has few choices." The banality of her statement, the sheer domesticity of her excuse in the face of such grotesque horror, was profoundly shocking. She spoke of butchering human beings as if it were no different from canning peaches or sewing quilts. Broussard felt a surge of revulsion. "Elodie Robichaux, you are under arrest for the crime of murder," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Felix moved to put her in handcuffs, but she simply raised a hand, a gesture not of resistance but of command. "There is no need for that, deputy," she said calmly. "I will not be going with you." A chilling smile touched her lips again. This place, it does not let people leave. Before Browsard or Felix could react, she reached down beside her chair and picked up a small, sharp paring knife that had been hidden in the folds of her dress. With a single, fluid motion that was shockingly fast, she drew the blade across her own throat. The cut was deep and precise. Blood, dark and shockingly plentiful, gushed from the wound, staining the front of her black dress. She made no sound, no gasp of pain. She simply slumped back in her chair, her empty eyes staring up at the ceiling, the faint, macabre smile still etched on her face. The aftermath of Elodie Robichaux's suicide was a study in chaos and horror. Browsard and Felix were left standing in the silent cabin, the coppery smell of fresh blood now mingling with the sweet, spicy odor of the jars. The sudden, violent act had left them stunned. The source of all the parish's fear, the center of this web of death and cannibalism, had simply checked out, taking her secrets with her. She had offered no confession, no explanation, no remorse. She had left them with only the horrifying evidence of her crimes and a final, defiant act of control. Browsard knew they had to secure the scene immediately. He sent Felix back in the boat, instructing him to go as fast as he could and return with reinforcements and the coroner. The young deputy was visibly shaken, happy to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. As Browsard waited alone in the growing twilight, the full weight of the situation settled upon him. He was alone in a house of horrors with the body of a killer and the remains of her many victims. The swamp, which had been unnervingly quiet, now seemed to come alive. Every splash in the water, every rustle in the undergrowth, sounded like a threat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Elodie was not the only monster inhabiting the gator's maw. Her last words echoed in his mind. This place, it does not let people leave. Was it just the final, cryptic utterance of a madwoman, or was it a genuine warning? Was there some other presence in the swamp, an accomplice or something far older and more sinister, that had driven her to these unspeakable acts? The line between criminal investigation and ghost story had completely dissolved. As darkness fell, the cabin became a suffocating tomb. Browsard lit a lantern, its flickering yellow light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock him. He began a more thorough search of the small room, his investigative instincts taking over, a desperate attempt to impose order on the madness. He needed answers. He needed a motive that went beyond a simple, chilling declaration of financial necessity. He started with a small, locked chest he found under her bed. Prying it open with a knife, he found it contained not money or valuables but a collection of personal items. Among them was a worn, leather-bound journal. It was Jean Pierre's. Browsard sat at the table, the lantern light illuminating the cramped, spidery handwriting. He began to read. The journal started years earlier, chronicling the daily life of a trapper. It spoke of lean seasons and plentiful ones, of the price of pelts, of the solitary, harsh existence in the bayou. But as the entries progressed, the tone began to shift. Jean-Pierre wrote of his growing frustration with poverty, his bitterness towards the prosperous merchants in town. Then the entries took a darker, more disturbing turn. He began to write about the swamp's bounty, about a forbidden meat that was plentiful and required no traps. He wrote of long pig, an old, chilling term for human flesh. Browsard felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Elodie had not been the originator of this horror. She had been an apprentice. Jean Pierre's journal was a horrifying recipe book, a detailed account of how to hunt, butcher, and preserve human beings. He described his first kill, a lone fisherman who had strayed too deep into the bayou, with a chilling, detached clarity. He was the monster. He had created this system. The question that now burned in Browsard's mind was, what had happened to him? The final entries in Jean Pierre's journal were frantic and paranoid. The detached, methodical tone of the earlier pages was gone, replaced by a scrawling, almost illegible script. He wrote that Elodie was changing. He claimed she had become too good at the craft, too enamored with it. He wrote that she had started experimenting, adding her own spices to the brine, developing new curing techniques. He accused her of wanting the business for herself. "She has the hunger now," one passage read. I see it in her eyes when she looks at me. She does not see a husband, she sees a fresh cut of meat. The last entry was short and terrifying. She has locked the door to the smokehouse. I hear her sharpening the knives. She says she has a new recipe she wants to try, a special one. Broussard closed the journal, his hands trembling. The mystery of Jean Pierre's disappearance was solved. He hadn't been taken by a gator or lost in the swamp. He had become a victim of his own monstrous creation. The apprentice had overthrown the master. Elodie had learned his horrifying trade and then, in a final act of macabre betrayal, had used it on him. He had become just another ingredient, his body likely rendered down, pickled, and sold by the jar at the St. Bernard market. The thought was so grotesque, so profoundly disturbing, that Broussard had to stand and walk to the door, gasping for the thick, humid night air. The horror of this case was not a straight line, but a sickening, vicious circle. Cannibalism, it seemed, was a family business, and business had been good. The sheer number of jars in the cabin testified to a long and prolific operation, one that had gone completely unnoticed until now. When the reinforcements finally arrived hours later, their boats cutting through the black water with lanterns held high, they found Sheriff Broussard sitting on the porch of the cabin, his face pale and grim in the lantern light. He said nothing, simply gesturing towards the inside of the cabin and the smokehouse. The sounds that followed were a mixture of shocked gasps, retching, and horrified curses as the deputies and the coroner took in the full scope of the abomination. The process of clearing the cabin was a grim, systematic affair. Every jar had to be opened, its contents examined and catalogued. The task fell to the coroner, a stoic man named Dr. Morrow, who seemed to be the only one capable of stomaching the gruesome work. He confirmed that the contents of the jars were, without a doubt, human. The remains in the smokehouse were also examined, revealing the grim fate of at least 3 different individuals. The methodical nature of the dismemberment pointed to a killer who was not only ruthless but also highly skilled. As they worked, a deputy made another discovery in a crawlspace beneath the cabin floor. It was a shallow grave, containing a collection of bones that had been stripped clean of all flesh. Among the bones, they found clothing, wallets, and personal effects, the sad, final remnants of the vanished men. They identified items belonging to Jacques the Trapper and 2 other drifters who had been reported missing months earlier. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of sustained, serial murder and cannibalism on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. The little cabin on the bayou was not a home. It was a factory of death, a place where human beings were treated as livestock. The news of the horrors discovered at the Robichaux's cabin spread through Plaquemines Parish like a fever. It traveled from the docks to the plantations, from the taverns to the church pews, carried on the hushed, terrified whispers of those who had been there. The story was so macabre, so far beyond the pale of normal human experience, that it took on the quality of a myth. The widow Robichaux was no longer just a murderer. She was transformed into a legendary monster, a bayou witch, a real-life boogeyman. The initial reaction was one of sickness and revulsion, especially among those who, driven by poverty or curiosity, had purchased and possibly consumed the contents of her jars. Geneviève Dubois was confined to her bed for a week, unable to eat, haunted by the memory of that small mole with its single, coarse hair. Others in the community fell ill, their sickness more a product of psychological trauma than any physical ailment. The thought of what they had ingested, the casual cannibalism they had unknowingly participated in, was a poison in their minds. A wave of collective guilt and horror washed over the parish. How could this have happened in their midst? How could a monster have operated so openly, selling her forbidden wares in the town market without anyone realizing the truth? The answer lay in the victims she chose. Drifters, loners, men without families or connections, people whose disappearance would create no immediate alarm. She and her husband had been preying on the fringes of their society, exploiting the anonymity of the desperate and the transient. They were ghosts even before they were killed, their final erasure from the world going almost entirely unnoticed. The community had been blind, not because they were foolish, but because the victims were deliberately chosen from among the invisible. In the weeks that followed, the story of the flesh-preserving widow became a national sensation. Newspaper reporters from New Orleans and even as far away as New York descended on the small parish, eager for every lurid detail. They dubbed Elodie the cannibal queen of the bayou and her cabin the House of Horrors. The tale was a perfect piece of Gothic American folklore, a mysterious widow, a primitive swamp setting, and the ultimate taboo of cannibalism. The articles were filled with sensationalist prose, describing Elodie as a demonic sorceress and her husband as a swamp-dwelling savage. The reality, as Broussard knew, was somehow both simpler and more terrifying. They were not supernatural monsters. They were human beings who had methodically stripped away their own humanity for profit and perhaps for pleasure. The cabin and smokehouse were eventually burned to the ground by a mob of enraged and terrified locals. They wanted to erase the stain of the Robichaux's existence from the land, to purify the ground with fire. They threw the remaining jars into the blaze, and the sound of the glass exploding in the intense heat was said to have echoed across the bayou for miles. But the fire could not erase the memory. It could not unsell the jars that had been sold, nor could it bring back the men who had been consumed. The story became a permanent scar on the psyche of the community, a forbidden history that parents would whisper to their children for generations, as a warning against talking to strangers and straying too deep into the swamp. The Gator's Maw was declared a cursed place, and no one dared to venture into that part of the bayou ever again. The investigation officially closed with Elodie's suicide and the confirmation of Jean Pierre's role from his journal. The case was, for all intents and purposes, solved. But for Sheriff Broussard, nagging questions remained, loose threads that kept him awake during the long, humid nights. The sheer number of victims was one such question. The remains found under the cabin and in the smokehouse accounted for perhaps half a dozen men. But the number of jars, both in the cabin and those likely sold at the market, suggested a much higher body count. How many more had there been? How many nameless men had ended their journey in Elodie's larder? The records of missing persons from that era were notoriously poor, especially for transients. It was possible, even likely, that the true number of their victims would never be known. Then there was the question of motive. Jean Pierre's journal spoke of poverty, but it also hinted at something darker, a thrill, a sense of power. And what of Elodie? Broussard recalled her final words, her justification that a widow must make her way. Was it truly just about survival? Or had she, as her husband's journal suggested, developed a hunger for the craft, a taste for the power of life and death? The image of her sitting so calmly in her chair, her face a mask of placid resignation even after he had discovered her charnel house, haunted him. It was not the face of a desperate woman. It was the face of someone who had transcended conventional morality, who had created her own dark and twisted world with its own set of rules. We are about to cross a threshold from which there is no return. To support our deep dives into the most disturbing cold cases in history, hit the like button. It tells us you're ready for the horrifying truth that lies beyond the official story. One of the most disturbing and persistent rumors that arose from the ashes of the Robichaux's cabin concerned the existence of a recipe book. Not Jean Pierre's journal, which was a chronicle of his crimes, but a separate book, a proper cookbook written in Elodie's neat, elegant hand. Several of the deputies who had been part of the initial clearing of the cabin swore they had seen it, a small, oilcloth-bound book sitting on the kitchen counter. They claimed it contained detailed recipes with titles like pickled man steak with cayenne, smoked loin of traveler, and vagrant's head cheese. They described illustrations, drawn with anatomical precision, showing the best cuts of meat to be harvested from a human body. However, when the official inventory of evidence was taken, the recipe book was nowhere to be found. It had vanished. Had it ever existed? Or was it a product of collective hysteria, a detail invented by traumatized minds to make the horror even more grotesque? Perhaps one of the deputies, recognizing its potential as a macabre and valuable artifact, had secretly pocketed it. The idea of such a book existing, of it being out in the world, was a chilling thought. It transformed the Robichaux's crimes from a series of brutal, opportunistic murders into a form of perverse, artisanal craft. It suggested a level of dedication and passion that was far more terrifying than simple, desperate cannibalism. The legend of the banned cookbook became a key part of the Elodie Robichaux's folklore, a forbidden text detailing the culinary secrets of the damned. Its absence only made the story more powerful, leaving the most horrifying details to the fertile ground of the public's imagination. Another unsettling aspect of the case that was never fully resolved was the question of local knowledge. Was it truly possible that the Robichaux's had operated for so long without anyone in the insular, tight-knit community having the slightest suspicion? In the official narrative, the parish was an innocent victim, duped by a monstrous couple. But in the hushed conversations that took place in private, a different story was sometimes told. Some of the older Cajuns, who knew the swamp better than anyone, would later claim they had known something was wrong at the Gator's Maw. They spoke of an unnatural silence around the Robichaux's cabin, an absence of animal life, as if the birds and gators and even the insects instinctively avoided the place. They spoke of strange lights seen flickering over the water late at night, and of a foul, sweet smell that would drift on the wind on nights when the Robichaux's were cooking. Why hadn't they come forward? The answer was a complex mixture of fear and a deep-seated tradition of not interfering in your neighbor's business, no matter how strange. The bayou was a place where people kept to themselves, where privacy was fiercely guarded. Furthermore, there was a genuine fear of the supernatural. To many, Elodie was not just a killer, she was a trait use, a folk healer who had turned to the dark arts. To cross her would be to invite a curse upon your family, to risk having your children born with deformities or your livestock die of mysterious illnesses. And so, they had kept their distance, averted their eyes, and pretended not to notice the unsettling signs, allowing the horror to grow unchecked. Ked in the dark heart of the swamp. The fate of the property itself became a source of local legend. After the cabin was burned, the land was left to be reclaimed by the swamp. No one would buy it, no one would even fish or trap in the waters of the Gator's Maw. It was considered tainted, haunted ground. Over the years, the story grew more elaborate. People claimed that on still, moonless nights you could see a strange light, a few follett, hovering over the spot where the cabin once stood. They said it was the tormented spirit of Elodie Robichaux's, forever bound to the site of her monstrous crimes, still tending to her ghostly smokehouse. Others claimed to hear faint, disembodied voices whispering on the wind, the final pleas of her many victims. Fishermen who accidentally strayed too close to the area reported their compasses spinning wildly and their boat engines mysteriously dying. The place developed a reputation similar to the Bermuda Triangle, a small patch of the Louisiana bayou from which boats and people would occasionally vanish without a trace. These disappearances were, of course, likely due to the treacherous and confusing nature of the waterways in that area. But in the popular imagination, every new vanishing was attributed to the lingering curse of the cannibal widow. The land had absorbed the evil that had been committed upon it, and it was now actively hostile to human life. The story served as a powerful deterrent, effectively quarantining the site and ensuring that the final resting place of Elodie's unknown victims would remain forever undisturbed, their bones slowly sinking into the Louisiana mud. Perhaps the most lasting and insidious legacy of the Elodie Robichaux's case was the paranoia it sowed. It fundamentally altered the community's relationship with food. The act of eating, once a source of communal joy and celebration, became tinged with suspicion. For years afterward, the local market suffered. People looked at preserved foods, sausages, pickled vegetables, potted meats, with a new and profound distrust. Every unmarked jar, every unfamiliar vendor was a potential source of horror. The phrase, "you never know what's in it," became a local saying, loaded with a dark, unspoken meaning. The incident tapped into a primal fear, the fear of contamination, of unknowingly consuming the forbidden, of being made a participant in a monstrous act against your will. It created a social poison that lingered for decades. Families began to rely almost exclusively on food they had grown or raised themselves. The tradition of buying from small, local producers was damaged, replaced by a preference for the new, industrially packaged goods that were beginning to appear from factories in the North. In a strange and tragic irony, the macabre tale of the flesh-preserving widow may have inadvertently helped usher in the age of processed, impersonal food in that corner of Louisiana. People were now willing to sacrifice the freshness and flavor of local produce for the sterile, anonymous safety of a factory-sealed can, a container guaranteed to be free of the intimate, horrifying touch of a neighbor's hand. The fear of the known had become greater than the fear of the unknown. Decades after the events of 1895, the story continued to evolve, taking on new and even more disturbing dimensions. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, a new element was added to the legend. A group of men, hired as part of a government project to dredge the waterways of the bayou, were working near the Gator's Maw. As their steam-powered dredge scooped up load after load of mud and silt from the bottom of the channel, it brought up something other than dirt. It was a dense, tangled mass of human bones. The workers were horrified. They had stumbled upon a subaquatic graveyard. The initial assumption was that they had found the remains of Elodie's other victims, those whose bodies had been disposed of in the water rather than processed in the smokehouse. An investigation was launched, but the technology of the time made identifying the remains impossible. There were dozens of skeletons, maybe more, all jumbled together. But as the coroner examined the bones, he noted something strange. The markings on them were not consistent with the clean, precise cuts of a butcher's knife. Instead, many of the bones bore the distinct, ragged marks of human teeth. It was a discovery so shocking, so completely outside the bounds of the original story, that it was quickly suppressed by local authorities, who feared it would cause a new wave of panic. The official report concluded that the bones were from an ancient, forgotten burial ground. But the truth was far more sinister. The Gator's Maw had not just been a dumping ground, it had been a feeding ground. This suppressed discovery of gnawed bones suggested a horrifying expansion of the original story. Had Elodie and Jean-Pierre been part of something larger, a secretive, isolated community or cult that practiced ritual cannibalism deep within the swamp? It was a theory that seemed to belong more to a penny dreadful novel than to a real criminal investigation, but the evidence was hard to ignore. This would explain the sheer number of victims, a number that seemed too high for just two people to manage. It would also explain the almost supernatural fear that the other locals had of the place, a fear that went beyond simple superstition. Perhaps they weren't just afraid of a witch. Perhaps they were afraid of a very real and very dangerous group of people who lived by a different, more primal set of rules. This theory cast Elodie Robichaux in a new light. Was she the queen of this cannibal cult, or merely one of its members? Was her market stall not a desperate attempt to make money, but a way of distributing their unholy sacrament to the outside world, a grim, private joke played on the civilized people of the parish? The idea was almost too monstrous to contemplate. It suggested that the evil was not contained within one burned-out cabin, but was endemic to the swamp itself, a festering secret society that had existed for generations, hidden away in the impenetrable marshes. The official story of the lone killer couple was terrifying enough, but this alternative narrative pointed to a deeper, more systemic horror, a whole community of monsters living just beyond the edge of the map. The mystery of Elodie Robichaux herself only deepened over time. With no living relatives to speak of and no one in the parish who claimed to have known her before she was married to Jean-Pierre, her origins remained a complete blank. She was a ghost who had drifted into the parish from parts unknown, and her past was a closed book. Who was she before she became the cannibal widow? Where did she learn the chillingly practical skills of butchery and preservation? Jean-Pierre's journal suggested he had taught her, but her proficiency, her hunger for the craft, hinted at a pre-existing disposition, a darkness that was already present within her, waiting for an opportunity to be unleashed. Some researchers, looking back at the case years later, speculated that she may have come from one of the isolated, inbred communities that were known to exist in the most remote parts of the swampland, places where old, pre-Christian European traditions and superstitions had survived, mutating into strange and sometimes violent forms. In this context, cannibalism might not have been a crime, but a ritual, a way of absorbing an enemy's strength or a loved one's spirit. This theory, while impossible to prove, offered a chilling explanation for her complete lack of remorse and her calm, almost beatific demeanor. She wasn't breaking the law in her mind, she was practicing her religion. Her final cryptic words, "This place, it does not let people leave," could be reinterpreted not as a threat, but as a statement of faith, a declaration of her eternal bond to the dark, hungry god of the swamp that she served. The psychological impact on Sheriff Broussard was profound and lasting. He had been the one to pull back the curtain, to stare directly into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. He retired from law enforcement less than a year after the case, a changed man. Friends and family said the light had gone out of his eyes. He became withdrawn and paranoid, prone to long silences and sudden fits of rage. He developed a deep, abiding phobia of the swamp, refusing to go anywhere near the water. He also stopped eating any kind of meat, subsisting on a meager diet of bread and vegetables. The man who had once been the parish's bastion of logic and reason had become a prisoner of the very fears he had once disdained. He was said to have kept Jean Pierre's journal, reading and rereading it at night, obsessed with understanding the madness it contained. Some claimed he was trying to decipher a hidden code, a secret message that would explain the true nature of the evil he had uncovered. He died in 1910, a recluse in his own home. In his final days, he was said to have been tormented by nightmares, waking up screaming that the widow was in his room, offering him a jar of her special preserves. The case had not just ended his career, it had consumed his soul, a final, posthumous victim of the horrors he had unearthed in the gator's maw. His personal tragedy served as a stark reminder that some truths are so dark, they can shatter the minds of those who discover them. Even the objects associated with the case became artifacts of pure dread. The shattered jar that Genevieve Dubois had brought to the sheriff was kept as evidence for a time, but it was eventually ordered to be destroyed. The deputies responsible for the task claimed that the glass shards seemed to hold a malevolent energy, that they were cold to the touch even on the hottest days. They smashed the pieces with a hammer and buried them in unconsecrated ground outside the town's cemetery. Similarly, the tools from Elodie's cabin, the knives, the cleaver, the bone saw, were supposed to be melted down. But according to local legend, the blacksmith tasked with the job found that the steel would not melt. No matter how hot he made his forge, the metal would only glow red, refusing to lose its shape. Terrified, he took the tools in the dead of night and threw them into the deepest part of the Mississippi River, hoping the powerful current would carry the curse away. These stories are, of course, folklore, the kind of embellishments that naturally attach themselves to a horrifying event. But they speak to a deeper truth about the nature of such profound evil. People believed that the Rabichaux's actions had imbued these inanimate objects with a tangible malevolence, a stain that could not be washed away, a dark energy that persisted long after the blood had been cleaned off. The curse was not just on the land. It was in the very atoms of the things they had touched. The story of the widow who sold jars of preserved flesh has become a cornerstone of Louisiana's dark folklore, sitting alongside tales of the Axeman of New Orleans and the vampire Jacques St. Germain. But unlike many of those other stories, the horror of Elodie Rabichaux is rooted in a terrifyingly plausible reality. There are no supernatural elements required to explain her actions. All that is required is an understanding of the crushing pressures of poverty, isolation, and a landscape that is both beautiful and brutal, a place where the line between civilization and savagery is as thin as a cypress needle. The tale serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist just beneath the surface of a community, hidden in plain sight. It preys on our most basic fears, the fear of the stranger, the fear of the wild, and the ultimate fear of being consumed, both literally and figuratively, by the darkness that surrounds us. It is a cold case that is, in a sense, still open. The full number of victims will never be known. The truth of Elodie's origins and motivations is buried with her. And the question of whether she and her husband acted alone or were part of a larger, more terrifying cult of swamp-dwelling cannibals remains unanswered, a disturbing possibility that lingers in the humid Louisiana air like the smell of smoke and decay. The Gator's Maw remains a forbidden place on the map, a testament to a time when a woman sold jars of preserved flesh at the market, and her customers paid a price far greater than a nickel. One final, disturbing story circulated in the parish for years, a tale that was only ever whispered and never written down. It concerned Genevieve Dubois, the woman whose horrifying discovery had brought the whole affair to light. After her initial sickness and terror, she had tried to return to a normal life, but she was changed. She became obsessed with cleanliness, constantly scrubbing her house from top to bottom. She also developed a strange and specific culinary habit. She began preserving things. It started innocently enough with jams and jellies, then moved on to pickled vegetables. But then, her husband Luke noticed she had begun preserving meat. She would spend hours in the kitchen, experimenting with different brines and spices, sealing the meat in glass jars that she would line up on shelves, just as Elodie had done. Luke was deeply disturbed by this. He would ask her what she was doing, and she would simply smile and say she was making sure they would never go hungry again. One day he came home from work to find her standing over a large tub, stirring a pungent, vinegary mixture. Floating in the brine was a large cut of meat he did not recognize. When he asked her what it was, she turned to him, her eyes wide and unnervingly bright. "It's a new recipe," she whispered, a chilling echo of the words from Jean Pierre's journal. "A special one." Luke, terrified, fled the house that night and never returned. Genevieve was found a week later, having taken her own life. The jars in her kitchen were all empty. Had the madness been contagious? Had the act of looking into the abyss, of tasting the forbidden fruit, planted a dark seed in her own mind? It was a final, horrifying coda to the story, suggesting that the curse of the widow was not just confined to the swamp, but could be passed on, a contagion of macabre obsession. Today, if you were to search for the records of the Elodie Robichaud's case in the Plaquemines Parish archives, you would find very little. A fire in the courthouse in 1922 destroyed a large portion of the 19th century records. The official file on the murders, including Sheriff Broussard's reports and the coroner's findings, was lost forever. All that remains are the sensationalized newspaper articles and the oral tradition of the folklore, a story that has been stretched and twisted with each retelling. This lack of official documentation has allowed the legend to grow wild and unchecked, a perfect cold case shrouded in mystery and myth. To some, the fire was a convenient accident, a final act in a long-standing cover-up by parish officials who wanted to bury the most shameful chapter in their history. Did the fire destroy evidence that would have implicated others in the community? Did it erase proof of the rumored cannibal cult that the authorities were unable or unwilling to confront? Or was it simply a random accident, a final insult from history that ensured the full truth of the matter would never be known? The absence of the official record leaves us with only the ghost of the story. We can never know for sure how many people vanished into Elodie's smokehouse, what her true motivations were, or how deep the rot in the community went. The file is gone, the cabin is ash, and the bones have long since dissolved into the bayou mud. The tale of the widow Robichaud's is ultimately a story about secrets, the secret of what was in the jars, the secret life of a seemingly quiet couple, the secrets kept by neighbors who were too afraid to speak up, the secrets buried in a madman's journal and a lost recipe book, and finally, the ultimate secret of the human heart and its capacity for a darkness that defies all explanation. Elodie Robichaud's remains an enigma, a perfect monster from American folklore precisely because she is so unknowable. Was she a victim who became a perpetrator? a pragmatic survivalist, a high priestess of a cannibal cult, a madwoman driven by a unique and horrifying psychosis. She is a blank canvas onto which we can project our deepest fears about what lies hidden behind a neighbor's friendly smile or at the end of a dark, lonely road. The story serves a timeless function as a cautionary tale, a piece of rural Gothic horror designed to enforce social boundaries and warn against the dangers of the wilderness, both the wilderness of the swamp and the wilderness of the human soul. It reminds us that the line between food and taboo, between survival and monstrosity, is sometimes terrifyingly thin. It is a story that lingers, like a strange and unpleasant aftertaste, a disturbing reminder of a time when a widow came in from the swamp, set up a table at the edge of town, and quietly sold jars of hell to her neighbors. In the end, what makes the 1895 case of the Louisiana widow so profoundly disturbing is its intimacy. This was not the work of a distant, impersonal monster. This was horror of a domestic nature. The tools she used were not exotic weapons, but common kitchen implements. Knives, a butcher's block, a smoking shed, and mason jars. She turned the wholesome, life-giving arts of cooking and preserving into a horrifying parody of domesticity. The market, a place of community and sustenance, became her hunting ground and her showroom. She weaponized the trust that exists between a food producer and a consumer, turning the most basic act of eating into a potential act of cannibalism. This perversion of the familiar is what makes the story so effective, so deeply unsettling. The greatest horrors are not those that come from another world, but those that wear a human face and live just down the road. Elodie Robichaux was not a demon or a ghost. She was a woman, a widow, a neighbor. And her secret ingredient, the one that made her Cajun spiced pork so unique, was humanity itself. It's a chilling thought that the most macabre monsters are not born of superstition, but are forged in the quiet, desperate corners of the world, their horrifying work hidden behind the closed door of a cabin, or inside an ordinary, unlabeled glass jar. The legacy of Elodie Robichaux has bled so deeply into the folklore of the region that it's now impossible to separate fact from fiction. Her story has become a permanent feature of the landscape, as much a part of the bayou as the cypress trees and the alligators. She exists now as a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered to frightened children and unnerved tourists. But the core of the story, the horrifying truth of it, remains. For a time in a small Louisiana parish, a woman methodically murdered men, butchered their bodies, and sold their preserved flesh to the public. How many jars were sold? How many people in their homes, in a moment of hunger, pried open a lid and unknowingly consumed the last remains of a vanished man? This is the final, unanswerable question that hangs over the entire case. The victims were not only the men who were killed, but also the people who became unwitting cannibals, their innocence stolen by a nickel purchase at the local market. The story of the widow has no clean resolution, no final justice. It simply fades into ambiguity and dread, leaving behind only the vine-choked patch of cursed earth where her cabin once stood, and a lingering, horrifying question for anyone who hears the tale. Are you ever truly certain what you're eating?